The breeze was supposed to be a blessing, a soft, coastal kiss against her cheek on the happiest day of her life. Instead, it was a thief, pulling the warmth from Nia's skin, leaving goosebumps on her bare shoulders. The lace of her gown felt like a beautiful, expensive cage. Below the manicured cliffside lawn, the Pacific Ocean churned, its endless rhythm a slow, mocking drumbeat counting out the seconds of her humiliation. 20 minutes. The guests, a curated collection of her fiancé's world, investors, society mavens, and the vaguely famous, had fallen into a strained, whispering silence. The string quartet had faded out 10 minutes ago, their bows resting on their instruments like surrendered weapons. Nia kept her eyes fixed on the floral arch, a riot of white roses and peonies that now seemed to be wilting in sympathy. Every blossom was a testament to Mark's taste, his money, his world. A world she had been about to formally enter. Her own family was a small, brave island in the sea of pastel suits and designer fascinators. Her mother's expression was a tight knot of worry. Her father stood stiffly, his hand hovering near the small of her back, a silent offer of retreat she could not yet accept. To retreat would be to admit it was over. A man in the back row shifted, and the movement drew her eye. He was an anomaly. While the other men wore light linen or seersucker, he was dressed in a suit of impossible black, tailored so precisely it seemed carved from shadow. He was not one of Mark's friends. She would have remembered him. He sat perfectly still, his posture an indictment of the nervous fidgeting around him. She could not see his face clearly, only the severe line of his jaw and the way his dark hair was cut with razor-sharp precision. There was something at his wrist, a glimpse of dark, intricate ink disappearing beneath a starched white cuff. He wasn't watching the empty space where the groom should be. He was watching her. That is when she made the mistake of looking down at her phone, tucked into her father's pocket for safekeeping. He saw her glance and silently passed it to her. One new message. From Mark. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. I can't.
I'm sorry.
Just that. 6 words to dismantle a life. The screen went blurry. The salty air thickened, pressing in on her, making it hard to breathe. The whispers from the guests grew louder, no longer restrained. They were the sound of social vultures circling. The beautiful cage of her dress was suddenly suffocating. Her world wasn't just turning upside down. The floor had dropped away entirely, leaving her in a free fall of public shame. Her father's voice was a low rumble beside her.
Nia.
Let's go. She nodded, a jerky, puppet-like motion. It was over. She had to walk back down that aisle, past all those pitying and triumphant eyes. She had to endure it. She took a single step, the heavy satin of her train dragging behind her like an anchor. Wait. The voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring like a razor. It was deep, quiet, and carried an authority that made every head turn. The man in the black suit was standing now. He moved with an unnerving grace, walking down the aisle toward her, not away. He moved like the room owed him space, and the guests parted for him as if by instinct. As he drew closer, the details sharpened. His face was all harsh, beautiful angles, his eyes dark and unreadable. A thin, white scar cut through one of his eyebrows, a flaw that only made his cold perfection more striking. He stopped before her, his gaze sweeping over her, not with pity, but with an unnerving, possessive assessment. He smelled of cedar and something else, something like cold smoke. He did not look at her father. He did not look at the stunned minister. He looked only at her. The arrangements have been made, he said, his voice low and even. The contracts are signed. A marriage was promised. Nia stared at him, bewildered. I don't understand. Who was this man? He spoke of her wedding like a business transaction. Her father stepped forward slightly. Sir, I think you're mistaken. This is a private matter. The man's eyes flickered to her father for a fraction of a second, a dismissal so complete it was more insulting than any glare. He returned his focus to Nia. Your fiancé, Mark, owed a debt. This marriage was the payment. His failure to appear is a breach of contract. A cold dread, colder than the ocean breeze, washed over Nia. A debt? Her marriage was a payment? Mark had told her this man, Kaido Tanaka, was a potential business partner from Tokyo, an important guest. He'd said nothing more. "Mark is gone," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. The man, Kaido, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod.
He is.
Which creates a problem. One I intend to solve. He took another step closer, close enough for her to see the dark, fathomless depth of his eyes. He was not offering comfort. He was issuing a statement. The wedding will proceed. A groom is required. The silence that followed was absolute. The ocean seemed to hold its breath. Nia felt the blood drain from her face. Was this a joke? A cruel, elaborate prank? But there was no humor in his expression. There was nothing in his expression at all but a chilling certainty. "You can't be serious," her father said, his voice tight with disbelief and rising anger. Kaido ignored him completely. His focus was a physical weight on Nia, pinning her in place. He was waiting for her answer, though it felt like he already knew what it would be.
He was not asking.
He was informing her of a reality she had not yet accepted. She had two choices. She could turn and walk away, disgraced and abandoned, the subject of gossip and pity for years to come. She could return to a life that had just been publicly shattered, with the fragments of her heart on display for everyone to see. Or there was this terrifying, insane alternative. A stranger in a black suit, with eyes like chips of obsidian and a voice that promised things she couldn't begin to understand. It was not a rescue. It felt like an acquisition. But in that moment, standing on the precipice of social ruin, the thought of walking away felt like a greater defeat than whatever this man was offering. Her survival instinct, the part of her that was competent under pressure, took over. It whispered that shame was a slow poison, while danger, at least, was quick. She lifted her chin, meeting his unblinking gaze. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the two of them, the abandoned bride and the predator who had stepped out of the shadows. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. A flicker of something, surprise? Respect, crossed his face before it was gone. "Kaido Tanaka." Nia took a deep breath, the salt air burning her lungs. She thought of Mark's 6 cowardly words. She thought of the whispering guests. She thought of the long, lonely walk of shame back down the aisle. Then she looked at the lethal certainty standing before her. "All right, Mr. Tanaka," she said, the words feeling alien and monumental as they left her lips. "Let's get married." The ride from the wedding venue was silent. Not a peaceful silence, but a heavy, charged vacuum that sucked the air from Nia's lungs. She sat in the back of a black sedan with windows so tinted the California sunshine was reduced to a dim, gray memory. The fine lace of her wedding dress felt absurd against the cold leather of the seat. Kaido sat beside her, a study in stillness, his hands resting on his knees. He hadn't spoken a word since they'd left her stunned family and the gawking guests behind. He'd given her father a single, black business card and said, "She will be safe. A car will be sent for you in 1 hour." It was not a reassurance. It was a command. Nia stared out the window, watching the manicured coastal estates give way to the sprawling, anonymous geometry of the city. She was married. To a man whose name she had learned less than an hour ago. A man who had bought her, in essence, to settle a debt. She told herself it was survival instinct, a desperate choice made in a moment of sheer panic. But a deeper, more honest part of her knew it was also pride. She had refused to be the woman left crying at the altar. Now, she was something else entirely.
She just didn't know what.
The car descended into an underground garage, the tires hissing on the polished concrete. They came to a stop before a private elevator. One of Kaido's men, a grim-faced man in an identical black suit, opened her door. Kaido got out and waited for her, his patience a cold, unnerving thing. She gathered the ridiculous mounds of her dress and stepped out. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse that was less a home and more a statement. It was a vast, minimalist space of glass, steel, and dark wood. One entire wall was a window overlooking the glittering sprawl of Los Angeles. The furniture was sparse, expensive, and brutally angular. There were no photographs, no clutter, no signs of a life lived. It was as impersonal as a museum, and just as silent. My housekeeper, Mrs. Sato, will show you to your room. She will provide you with a change of clothes, Kaito said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. He began to unbutton his suit jacket. We will speak later. A small, older Japanese woman in a simple gray dress appeared as if from nowhere, bowing her head slightly. She looked at Nia with eyes that were kind but deeply sad. Nia's throat was dry. My room. Kaito paused, his hand on his jacket. He turned his head, and his dark eyes met hers. We are married. We are not husband and wife. You will have your own space. For now. The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. Mrs. Sato gestured for Nia to follow her down a long, white hallway. Each step felt like a surrender. The room she was led to was luxurious and just as sterile as the rest of the penthouse. A king-sized bed with a severe gray duvet. Another wall of glass with a view of the city. A bathroom of black marble. It was a beautiful prison cell. Mrs. Sato laid out a simple silk robe and some toiletries on the bed. Please let me know if you require anything else, she said in a soft, accented voice, and then she was gone, closing the door with a quiet click. Nia stood in the middle of the room, the weight of her wedding dress pulling her down. She unzipped it with fumbling fingers, letting the expensive fabric pool at her feet like a shed skin. The girl who had put that dress on this morning was gone. She had been naive, hopeful, in love. The woman standing here now, in a stranger's home, married to a man who looked at her like a possession, was someone else. She didn't know who she was yet. Later, after a shower that failed to wash away the day's unreality, she found him in the main living area. He was standing before the great window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He had changed into a simple black shirt and trousers, but he looked no less dangerous. If anything, the casual clothes made the coiled tension in his body more apparent. What was the debt? Nia asked, her voice sounding small in the vast room. He didn't turn. Mark made promises to my organization he could not keep. He offered access to his father's shipping logistics. He offered a partnership. He lied. And he offered me? The question was bitter. Your marriage to him would have connected his family's legitimate enterprise to my less legitimate one. A respectable face. A bridge into a world that is usually closed to me. He finally turned, swirling the liquid in his glass. His cowardice was an insult. One that required an answer. So, you married me instead. To prove a point, I married you because a deal is a deal. The Yakuza do not tolerate broken oaths. Yakuza. The word landed in the quiet room like a stone. She had suspected, of course. The ink, the men, the chilling authority. But hearing him say it made it terrifyingly real. She had not just married a stranger. She had married a gangster. A mafia boss. What do you want from me? She asked, wrapping the silk robe tighter around herself. For now, your compliance, he said, his voice flat. You will live here. You will want for nothing. In return, you will be my wife in name. You will be seen with me when I require it. You will be a shield. My enemies will not expect me to have an American wife. They will see you as a weakness. They will be wrong. His gaze drifted to a single, ornate wooden box on a low table. It was the only object in the room that seemed personal. He walked over to it, running a finger along the carved lid. Weakness is a liability I do not permit myself, he said, his voice softer now, almost haunted. I had a sister.
Hannah.
She was not part of my world, but my enemies knew she was important to me. They used that. They took her from me to send a message. He looked up at Nia, and for the first time, she saw something behind the cold mask. A deep, ancient wound. Her death taught me a valuable lesson. Never love what you are not willing to lose. That was when she understood. He had chosen her, a stranger, precisely because he felt nothing for her. She was a tool, a strategy, an emotionless contract. There was no risk of her becoming another Hannah. Days bled into a week. Nia lived in a state of suspended reality. She ate meals prepared by Mrs. Sato, read books from a sterile library she was sure Kaido had never entered, and watched the city lights ignite every evening from behind acres of soundproof glass. She was a ghost in his life, and he was a phantom in hers, coming and going at odd hours, always surrounded by his silent, watchful men. One night, she couldn't sleep. The silence of the penthouse was pressing in on her. She walked through the darkened apartment, drawn to the living area. The city below was a river of light. She saw a flicker of movement on the balcony and stepped closer to the glass. Kaido was out there, leaning against the railing, looking out at the city. He was on the phone, his voice a low, angry murmur of Japanese. Even from a distance, she could feel the cold fury emanating from him. He ended the call abruptly, snapping his phone shut. He stood there for a long time, his shoulders tight with a tension that seemed to vibrate through the glass. Then he did something she never expected. He slammed his fist into the concrete pillar of the balcony, a single, sharp crack of sound. He leaned his forehead against the cool stone, his whole body rigid with a pain he clearly thought no one could see. The moment was raw, unguarded. A crack in the perfect, cold facade. She should have retreated. She should have gone back to her room and pretended she had seen nothing. But she didn't. She slid the heavy glass door open. The sound was soft, but in the silence it was like a gunshot. He straightened instantly, turning to face her. His mask was back in place, but not before she had seen the storm behind it. His knuckles were bleeding. "You should be in bed," he said, his voice rough. "So should you," she replied, her own voice quiet. She took a step out onto the balcony, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her arms. "What's wrong?" "It is not your concern. You made me your concern when you forced me to marry you." She shot back, a spark of her old fire returning. "If your enemies are my enemies, then I think I have a right to know when they're making you punch walls." He stared at her, his expression unreadable in the half-light. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the city. She could have left then, apologized, retreated to her room, and maintained the careful distance between them. But she stayed. She held his gaze, refusing to back down. It was a deliberate choice. He finally looked away, down at his bleeding hand. A shipment was intercepted by a rival.
The same man Mark was in debt to.
Kenji Sato. And this Kenji, he's the one who is angry about our marriage. He sees it as a move against him. An acquisition of an asset he believed was his. Kaido's voice was laced with contempt. He is a man who deals in insults and provocations. He is testing me. Nia walked to the small first aid kit on a nearby table, one she knew Mrs. Sato kept stocked. She opened it and took out antiseptic wipes and a bandage. She walked back to him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She held them out. "Here." He looked from the supplies to her face, a flicker of something unidentifiable in his eyes.
He didn't take them.
So, she took another step, closing the distance between them. Her hands were shaking slightly as she took his larger, calloused one. His skin was warm. She gently cleaned the blood from his scraped knuckles. He stood perfectly still, letting her. His stillness was not passive. It was a conscious act of restraint. She could feel the power thrumming just beneath his skin, the violence he kept leashed. She wrapped the bandage around his hand, her fingers brushing against his. The contact was electric, a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with contracts or debts. His gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. He was watching her, really watching her for the first time. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the things they were not saying. When she was finished, she let go of his hand, but he didn't pull away immediately. He stood there, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. "Because you were bleeding," she said simply. He lifted his bandaged hand, looking at it as if it were a foreign object. Then he looked at her. "You are not afraid of me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of discovery. I am, she admitted, her voice barely audible. But I'm still here. That was the moment everything changed. In the cold night air, high above the city, with the faint smell of blood and cedar between them, the line between prisoner and partner began to blur. He hadn't touched her, not really, but she felt branded by his proximity, by the charged silence that said more than words ever could. The attack came 2 nights later. It was brutally efficient. They didn't storm the penthouse, they waited for him. As the private elevator opened into the underground garage, 2 black sedans boxed their car in, headlights flaring to life, blinding them. The world erupted in the concussive roar of gunfire. Kaido moved before Nia could even process what was happening. In a single, fluid motion, he unbuckled her seatbelt and threw his body over hers, shoving her down onto the floor of the car. His weight was immense, a solid shield of muscle and bone. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and shattered glass. Bullets hammered against the armored sides of the car like metallic hail. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl in her ear, his breath hot against her skin. She could feel the rhythmic thump of his heart against her back, a steady, lethal beat in the midst of chaos. His men, in a second car, were returning fire. The garage became a war zone of ricocheting bullets and shouting. Kaido drew a sleek, silver pistol from a holster she hadn't known was there. He fired twice through the shattered windshield, the sound deafening inside the car. One of the attacking men screamed and fell. He moved with the chilling choreography of a man born to violence. An attacker wrenched her door open. A hand grabbed her arm, trying to drag her out. Nia screamed, kicking and struggling. Kaido roared, a sound of pure predatory rage. He twisted, firing over her head. The man grunted and fell backward. But another was already there, reaching for her. In that split second, Nia's survival instinct took over. Her eyes latched onto a heavy, metal fire extinguisher mounted on the garage wall just outside the open door. Without thinking, she lunged. She grabbed the handle, surprised by its weight, and swung it with all her might into the face of the man reaching for her. There was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. He collapsed. The garage fell silent, the echoes of gunfire fading into the hiss of a busted pipe. Kaido was on his feet, his gun leveled, scanning the shadows. His men were securing the area, their movements swift and professional. Nia stood panting, the heavy extinguisher still in her hand, her knuckles white. There was blood on the pristine silk of the blouse Mrs. Sato had given her. It wasn't hers. She had crossed a line. The girl in the wedding dress would have cowered on the floor. This new woman, this stranger inhabiting her skin, had fought back. She had hurt someone.
Badly.
She looked at the man on the ground, at the blood pooling beneath his head, and felt a wave of nausea, followed by a cold, terrifying calm. Kaido turned to her. His eyes swept over her, checking for injuries. When he saw none, his gaze fell to the extinguisher in her hand, then to the man she had taken down. His expression was unreadable, but the intensity of his focus made her skin prickle. He took the extinguisher from her numb fingers, his own brushing against hers. He set it down with a soft metallic clang. "Kenji sent them for you," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "He no longer sees you as a shield. He sees you as a target." Later, back in the pristine fortress of the penthouse, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving a shaky exhaustion in its wake. Mrs. Sato, her face pale but her hand steady, brought them both whiskey. Kaido dismissed her with a nod. They stood by the window, the city lights below seeming impossibly peaceful. Nia stared at her reflection in the glass. She saw the bloodstain on her blouse, the wildness in her own eyes. She didn't recognize herself. Kaido came to stand beside her. He held out his glass, a silent offering. She took it, her hand shaking so badly the amber liquid sloshed against the crystal. "I chose you because you were an outsider," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I thought you were innocent, breakable. A piece on the board that my enemies would not understand. I was wrong. It was not a compliment. It was a confession." an admission of his own miscalculation. The tension between them was a living thing, a wire-pulled taut. "I stayed because I thought it was safer than running," she confessed in turn, her voice raw. "I told myself it was survival. I was lying to myself." He turned to face her fully. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently flick a tiny shard of glass from her hair. The gesture was so small, so unexpectedly tender, it stole her breath. "You are not safe here, Nia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name when they were alone. It sounded different in his mouth. Not a label, but a discovery. He will not stop. "Then what do we do?" she asked. "We end it," he said, his eyes turning cold and hard as granite. "We remove Kenji from the board.
Permanently."
The plan was audacious, built on Nia's unique position. Kenji, believing her to be Kaido's pampered, terrified new wife, wouldn't expect her to be a threat. He was hosting a private gathering at one of his restaurants, a celebration of his perceived victory in the garage. Kaido's men could not get close, but she could. "No," Kaido said, the word absolute. "It's too dangerous." "It's the only way," Neo insisted, her voice firm. She was no longer the woman who stood passively by. She had a stake in this. Her life was on the line. "He knows Mark. He knows Mark's world. I can pretend to be a desperate woman looking for a way out. I can tell him I want to trade information on you for my freedom. He will kill you." "Not before he listens," she countered. "His ego won't let him. I will be the distraction you need. While he's focused on me, your men can move in." He watched her, a war raging in his dark eyes. The cold tactician in him knew she was right. The man who had seen his sister die because of him was recoiling in horror. Finally, he gave a single, sharp nod. The cost of this world was absolute, and sometimes the most valuable piece had to be put at risk. 2 nights later, Nia walked into Kenji Sato's restaurant. She wore a simple, elegant black dress, a stark contrast to the white gown she'd last worn in public. She had no weapon, only a hidden earpiece connecting her to Kaido. His voice was a low, steady presence in her ear. "Report," he murmured. "I'm in," she whispered back, her bag held tight in her hand. Kenji was exactly as she'd imagined, slick, arrogant, with eyes that stripped a person bare. He greeted her with a smile that was all teeth. "Mrs. Tanaka, what an unexpected pleasure. Has your husband misplaced you?" "My husband is the reason I'm here," Nia said, injecting a tremor of fear into her voice. "I want out." She played her part perfectly. The terrified bride, trapped in a golden cage, desperate to escape. She offered him scraps of information, Kaido's travel schedules, the names of his lieutenants, lies Kaido had fed her. Kenji listened, his eyes gleaming with greedy triumph. He led her to a private room in the back, away from the main floor. "My men are in position," Kaido's voice came through the earpiece. "Keep him talking." But Kenji was smarter than they'd anticipated. As he poured her a drink, his eyes fell to the subtle line of the earpiece against her skin. His smile vanished. "A clever little bird," he hissed, grabbing her arm. "Did you really think it would be so easy?" He shoved her against the wall, his hand clamping over her mouth. His men appeared, guns raised. Nia's heart plummeted. The plan had failed. "It's a trap," she managed to say into her collar, hoping Kaido heard. Suddenly, the world exploded. The shoji screens behind Kenji shattered as Kaido's men crashed through. The fight was brutal and fast. In the chaos, Kenji dragged Nia toward a back exit, holding a knife to her throat. "One more step and she dies," he snarled at Kaido, who stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury, his gun unwavering. Nia's mind raced. She was not a damsel. She would not be a passive victim. She remembered Kaido's bleeding knuckles, the weight of the fire extinguisher. She drove her heel down hard on Kenji's instep. He roared in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all Kaido needed. A single shot, precise and surgical. Kenji's eyes went wide with surprise before he collapsed. The silence that followed was deafening. Nia stood shaking, the ghost of a blade at her throat. Kaido crossed the room in 3 long strides.
He didn't speak.
He simply reached out and pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in a fierce, possessive embrace. He buried his face in her hair, and she felt a shudder rack his powerful frame. It was not comfort. It was a claim, an acknowledgement of what he had almost lost. Back in the penthouse, the city lights seemed brighter. The danger had passed, leaving a strange, quiet clarity in its wake. A cost had been paid. Kenji was gone, but the violence of that world was now etched into her soul. Her old life was not just gone. It was a foreign country she could never visit again. Kaido stood before her. He gently touched the faint red line on her throat where the knife had been. His touch was no longer hesitant. It was certain. "This is my world, Nia," he said, his voice raw. "It will always have a cost." He met her eyes, and the mask was gone. There was only the man, scarred and dangerous and real. "But you will never pay it alone." It was not a declaration of love. It was a vow, a promise forged in blood and fear. It was more honest, more real than any promise whispered over an altar. He didn't need to say more. She understood. She was no longer a pawn, a shield, or a contract. She was his. And in a way that terrified and thrilled her, he was hers. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. She saw the woman in the black dress, the survivor with fire in her eyes. She did not recognize the girl in the white wedding gown, and for the first time, she did not miss her. This was her reality now, a kingdom of shadows with a dangerous king. A conscious choice had to be made. She turned away from the reflection of the city, away from the ghost of who she used to be. She turned toward him, and she did not look back.